Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the University of Southern California. On behalf of all of us at USC and the USC School of Policy, Planning, and Development, we are delighted to partner with the Ronald Reagan Presidential Foundation and honored to share in this historic centennial celebration. At the risk of repeating myself to those who joined us earlier for our panel presentation, I'd like to take a moment to give you some background on how this symposium came to be. As you know, if Ronald Reagan were still living, he would turn 100 on February 6th. So to commemorate Ronald Reagan's legacy, there are several celebratory events around the world, including in Washington, D.C., London, and Berlin, and other places. This symposium differs from those other events in that we are taking a academic scholarly examination of the legacy of President Reagan. And these symposia also give us the opportunity to bring the legacy of President Reagan to a next generation, to our students here at USC, and eventually at other symposia like this in other parts of the country. As you probably realize, many of our students, and this hits me particularly as a professor, many of our students weren't born at the time that President Reagan was president. And so for him, he is a historical figure, much like Dwight Eisenhower might be for me or some of the rest of us. So let me give a special welcome again at this session to all the students that are here joining us today. President Reagan was an effective leader, well known for his communication style, staying on message, and focusing on top priorities. He fostered a public dialogue about the appropriate role for government in our society. He also exercised leadership in his relations with the Congress and in his relationships with other foreign leaders in other countries, and in his ability to seize the moment and show strength and courage in that moment. And he also showed leadership in his role in solidifying the political coalition that still to this day underpins the Republican Party. So there is a lot that all of us, both students and scholars alike, can learn from the way that he functioned as a communicator, but also as a leader and decision maker in the state of California and as president. And now I would like to introduce the executive director of the Ronald Reagan Centennial Celebration, Stewart Maclaurin. In this role, Stewart works on behalf of the Reagan Foundation to plan and execute the events surrounding the centennial of President Reagan's birth. And this is a great job because they're doing events at the Super Bowl. They did an event at the Rose Bowl, so we're pleased that he also is willing to come over here to USC away from all these more glamorous, dramatic events that will be taking place over the next weeks. Prior to his appointment at the foundation, he served as senior management positions at the Edison International, the Motion Picture Association of America, and Georgetown University, and he was chief of staff for Elizabeth Dole for 5 years when she was president of the American Red Cross. Stewart is a true gentleman. He's enormously capable, and I have to say, a great person to work with in planning this symposium. So please welcome Stewart Maclaurin.
Thank you very much, Dean Knott, Provost Garrett. It's an honor to be here this afternoon on behalf of the Ronald Reagan Presidential Foundation and our Board of Trustees, two of whom are with us this evening. Governor Pete Wilson is in the back of the room. And Michael Castine is here in the front. I'd also like to extend our thanks and appreciation to the faculty, staff, and students and all involved in the USC community, particularly in the School of Policy, Planning, and Development, the Bedrosian Center, and the Annenberg School. It was about 15 months ago that I had the opportunity to have lunch with Dean Knott and John Crow and Dick DeBakis of the USC Board of Trustees in the faculty club, and we were scheming and dreaming a little bit about ideas and opportunities for how we could partner together as a great American university and a foundation representing a great American president on the occasion of his centennial. So the idea of this academic symposium was born, and from it came partnerships now with the University of Virginia, which we will have next week in Washington, D.C., Notre Dame University, and the United States Naval Academy, which will both take place next fall. Each of these will focus on a different aspect of the president's life, his leadership, and his legacy. President Reagan had a strong and warm rapport with the University of Southern California. He was on this campus many times. In fact, it was 22 years ago this very week that President Reagan actually celebrated his 78th birthday on this campus. And one of the elements of that celebration was an appearance by the USC Marching Band. And they have a recurring theme in the president's life. They were there for that 78th birthday celebration. They sent him off to Washington when he went to the White House in 1980, January of 1981. And they welcomed him back to California in January of 1989. And they're going to be at the Reagan Library in Simi Valley this Saturday night when we celebrate the 100th birthday of President Reagan. So a little bit of a memento for that occasion that I'd like to give Jack. We reached into our archives, and we found this picture of President Reagan with the Trojan helmet that was taken on the occasion of his return to California in 1989. You know, the centennial is an opportunity to celebrate, but as you've seen here this afternoon, it's also an opportunity to examine. We have a diverse array of events that are planned throughout this year. We started on January the 1st with a Ronald Reagan-themed float in the Tournament of Roses parade that was seen by 52 million people on television around the world, and that was an exciting way to kick off the year. Then we have a balance with substantive. I've spoken of the academic partnerships that we have. And as Jack alluded to, reaching the next generation of young Americans and future American leaders is a vital part of what we're doing with the centennial. We have many facets to do that. We have a youth leadership committee, which is comprised of 18 to 25-year-olds, none of whom knew President Reagan as a living president. There are 12 Olympic athletes, entertainers, representative student leaders from across America. If you go to our website at reagancentennial.com, you'll see you'll hear in their voices how they viewed the president, and it's really inspiring to read their quotes and hear what they have to say about a great man, not just a figure of history, but a man whose life and legacy is relevant today and an example to them and their future as they're planning their lives and their careers. We're developing academic curriculum for high school students that will be sent to 14,000 high schools across the country. And we're doing other things. We have the Annenberg Center, actually representatives of our Discovery Center here with us today, which is a student resource that we have at the library that brings 25,000 5th through 8th graders through the library every year for a very hands-on, interactive, probably the most incredible teaching tool I've ever seen, certainly at a library or a museum. We are undertaking many international partnerships and events, as Jack alluded to. We are unveiling on July 4th, 2011, a statue of President Reagan in Grosvenor Square in London, and we're working with many governments and groups around the nation to dedicate squares, streets. We're going to be having a few international academic symposia. There's one in Hungary that takes place next month to begin that partnership. On Monday, we will open to the public a $15 million museum renovation, which is an extraordinary experience. If you've not been to the Reagan Library in Simi Valley, California, that's a mistake. You got to come. It's incredible. Most people in this part of town think it's far away, but tomorrow you can come out and visit us and participate in the second part of this symposium, but come back after Monday and experience this incredible museum experience. Very interactive, very hands-on. We're already the most visited presidential library of all 12 in the United States, and we're only getting better. And you know, we're a destination location. We're out at the 101, about 50 miles, and we're not on Wilshire Boulevard where you're going to trip by us and just come inside. So we're really proud that we have a man whose life and legacy represents something that people will travel far, come from across the country, around the world, and even across town to come and visit the Reagan Library. So we really want to invite you to come out there. I'd love to show you around personally, and we're really proud and excited about what we have, and we're going to be unveiling on Monday. Last thing I'll tell you about with the Centennial, and Jack alluded to this as well, is the sports partnerships. President Reagan began his career as a sports broadcaster in his early 20s, and he thought that was the pinnacle. The greatest thing that he could ever do was to be a sports broadcaster. So we've been successful and fortunate to have partnerships established with the NFL, where this Sunday in Dallas, Texas, we'll have a 3-minute video tribute to President Reagan that we've developed working with the NFL that will show before the kickoff on that 180-foot by 60-foot mammoth screen that's in the football stadium there in Dallas. We have partnership with the Northern Trust Open, the formerly LA Open here in Los Angeles, where on the 19th of this month, we'll have a Ronald Reagan hospitality venue that men and women of the armed services will be admitted for free, and they can come by and learn more about President Reagan, and we can develop a relationship with them and really thank them for their service. We were able to announce this partnership last week on the deck of the USS Ronald Reagan, and we have 2 of the great sailors on that ship that are part of our National Youth Leadership Committee that I mentioned a few moments ago. We also have a partnership with several Major League Baseball teams that will take place the first weeks of the season this spring, and with NASCAR. The president actually started the Firecracker 400 from Air Force One in 1984 as he landed in Daytona for that great race that Richard Petty won, and we're going to be paying tribute to the president at Daytona, at Phoenix, and at Fontana with 3 races this year. So it's going to be a busy year, and those are just the highlights. And we're really excited about the events that we have planned that are celebratory, but the substantive partnerships that we have. You know, we could plan and execute a lot of things that are like fireworks going off in the sky, and everybody goes ooh and ah, and they dissipate, and the sky is dark again. But we want to start a fire of ideas and understanding and analysis and thorough understanding of who Ronald Reagan was, because we believe he was and he is a great leader. And it's terrific to hear great minds opine about their perspectives and to hear voices of practitioners like we heard who knew the man up close and personal, and blend these voices so that we can all have a better understanding and a greater respect for this true great American leader. I wanted to say in closing that I was fortunate for many years to be a chief of staff to the president at Georgetown University, and in that experience I learned a little bit about academic freedom and the expression of ideas and the free exchange of ideas. And we think it's important to not just be a shining repository on a hill in Simi Valley, but to be an integral voice in the public debate, to provide a platform for great voices and debate at the library, but also go into important places of ideas like here at USC. And so that's why we've reached out to these great institutions and have partnerships with USC and Virginia and Notre Dame and the Naval Academy and others. And we believe that President Reagan's legacy is strong, that it will sustain and survive the analysis and the test of time. We believe it's true that he's an influence to leaders of today and leaders of tomorrow. You've got the youngest member of Congress is 29 years old. He's Aaron Schock of Illinois, and he's the first member of Congress that was born during the Reagan administration. That make you feel a little old. But he is a strong spirit, a strong congressman in the spirit and in the vein of President Reagan, and he'll be with us to tell his story and to celebrate the president's birthday this weekend. And then you have President Obama, who took the president's biography with him on vacation. So he's a man of relevance and a leader of relevance today. And those of us who had the opportunity and the privilege, and Michael had positions of key leadership in the administration, and I had a very lowly junior position, but we were all honored and privileged to serve. And here was a man that we never, we had the reference to the breaking of laws earlier, but here was a man that we had complete confidence in, and we each had to have our own integrity in our service to him. And there was never any spirit of law-breaking, or certainly nothing that was encouraged by him or the leadership ever in those years. And then we believe his legacy is principled. He's a benchmark to a philosophy of thinking that is very active and relevant today. and that we're here to learn more about this afternoon. So thank you very much for your time and the partnership, and we really look forward to developing many great friendships through these 2 days and over the course of the year. And please come to the library. Look forward to seeing you there.
Stewart, thank you for that great picture. We'll cherish that. And also, thank you very much for the opportunity to collaborate with you and the Reagan Foundation. It's really been a wonderful collaboration. At this time, I'd like to introduce the Provost and the Senior Vice President for Academic Affairs of USC, Beth Garrett. As the university's second-ranking officer, Provost Garrett oversees USC's 18 schools, including SPPD, in addition to many other activities at the university, such as student affairs, libraries, information technology, research, student religious life, and enrollment services. And she also sits on the governing board of the USC hospitals, so a very wide portfolio of leadership here at the university. Previously, she served as USC's Vice President for Academic Planning and Budget. And she is still and currently a professor in the Gold School of Law. And one of the challenging things for people like myself is Beth Garrett, despite all these tremendous administrative leadership responsibilities, continues to publish journal articles every year by some magical process that I haven't quite been able to figure out, on topics from the legislative process to the federal budget process, administrative law, and tax policy. Before entering academics, she's clerked for Justice Thurgood Marshall on the U.S. Supreme Court. So, ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Provost Beth Garrett.
Hello and welcome to you all on behalf of President Nikias and our academic community. Before I introduce tonight's speaker, Professor Kevin Starr, I'd like to thank some of the people responsible for this event. First, let me thank the faculty and staff of the USC School of Policy Planning and Development, the USC Annenberg School of Communication and Journalism, and the USC Bedrosian Center on Governance and the Public Enterprise, all of whom have produced this conference. We'd also like to thank the team at the Ronald Reagan Presidential Foundation who collaborated with USC to create this event. President Reagan once said, "Education is a lifelong process that benefits individuals and entire communities and helps lay the foundation for the future." I'm so pleased that in that spirit, USC and the Foundation have been able to work together to further the education about our nation and our state. USC and the Ronald Reagan Presidential Foundation have a natural intellectual connection, one we've just seen concretely visualized in Ronald Reagan's Trojan hat. I think that's largely because of USC's longstanding interest in the study of state and local government in addition to the federal government. The breadth of USC's approach is unusual, as there are very few institutions of higher learning that sponsor serious and excellent programs studying government at all levels. Yet such a comprehensive approach is very necessary in my own view, because that's the only way to accurately understand the policies and results in a system of government predicated on federalism as ours is. Although most Americans think of Ronald Reagan as president, we know in California, and I'm sure Professor Starr will remind us, that President Reagan's political career began in our state when he served 2 terms as governor, succeeded in that role by our current governor, Jerry Brown, in his first incarnation as governor. Also, USC's School of Policy Planning and Development includes rigorous scholars who ask interesting questions about when government can effectively take action through regulation, taxation, or other methods to shape private actions in a particular direction, and when private actors are best left to solve problems independently. Finally, I want to acknowledge all the visiting scholars who are here today with us. I find that it's always easier to convince people to come to Los Angeles in January and February, and I suppose it's not too bad you missed a blizzard. You may be with us for a while. The beach is on to the west. Tomorrow we're going to have the pleasure, as you know, of a keynote address by Tom Brokaw, as well as panel discussions with Jeff Cowan and others who will lead us through President Reagan's life and examine how key events shaped his legacy. As you know, on any campus as vibrant and as busy as ours, we always have a number of great events happening at the same time. This morning, Justice Anthony Kennedy was in the Gould School of Law talking with our students. I had the pleasure of having lunch with him, and I wanted just to share that I mentioned this event to him, and his face lit up. And he told me a couple of really terrific stories about Governor Reagan at the time. And he ended with what I think must be the highest compliment a lawyer can pay, which is, he was my very best client. Now, it is my very great privilege to introduce University Professor Kevin Starr, a person who is eminently qualified to speak about this Californian who became president. A fourth-generation Californian, Dr. Starr was born, raised, and educated in San Francisco. He traveled east for graduate education at Harvard and then military service in Europe before returning to his native state. He's been a journalist, author, historian, observer of culture, professor, and sage on all things California. He served as the California State Librarian for 10 years, and he was recognized for his service to California and made State Librarian Emeritus by outgoing Governor Schwarzenegger. Dr. Starr is perhaps best known for his multi-volume series, Americans in the California Dream. These histories are widely recognized as the definitive work on the people who moved to or were lucky enough to have been born in California, as well as the state that they shaped. Dr. Starr's latest book is entitled Golden Gate, The Life and Times of America's Greatest Bridge. Herbert Gold, writing in the Wall Street Journal, said of the book, Kevin Starr, the preeminent contemporary chronicler of California life and culture, has now given us an ecstatic meditation on the complicated drama of the Golden Gate Bridge and its chronicle of history. I recommend it highly. It's a terrific book. Among his many honors, Dr. Starr was made a university professor in 1998, USC's highest honor for interdisciplinary scholars. He was awarded the National Humanities Medal by President Bush for his work as a scholar and a historian, and is a recipient of USC's Presidential Medallion. He is currently the Associate Dean of the USC Libraries, and he has been integral to a project very close to my own heart, the USC Academy for Polymathic Study. He is indeed a polymath. And the Academy is going to be formally inaugurated in February 7th to bring interdisciplinary tools to bear to solve and think about some of the most vexing problems of our contemporary culture. He is a terrific speaker, colleague, and friend. Please welcome Dr. Kevin Starr.
Thank you very much, Provost. And what a pleasure to be here this evening. And I'd like to pay special recognition to Governor Pete Wilson, who appointed me state librarian. And I had many wonderful years working for Governor Wilson and finding out what a marvelous gentleman he is and remains. To address the topic, Ronald Reagan's California, which Dean Knott gave me, I didn't choose my topic, although I'm happy to give it a try, is to attempt to explore a challenging relationship. First of all, for all his clarity of communication, his one-liners, his sense of humor, his autobiography, his ability to communicate to the public that what you see is what you get, there remains something opaque, something, in my opinion, something even mysterious in Ronald Reagan. Dealing with a president of genius or near-genius intellect, Gary Wills has described Thomas Jefferson as the Great Sphinx. In an effort to probe through metaphor and analogy that for all the clarity of Jefferson's intellect, its formation in the comprehensive reasonableness of the Enlightenment, there remains something impenetrable, sphinx-like, dark and mysterious at the center of the mind and personality of this luminously intelligent president. In the case of Ronald Reagan, we are presented with a different kind of dilemma. We do not have a visibly or even traditionally luminous intellect formed by the great tradition. We have, rather, a man of powerful intelligence, a man of popular, even demotic, certainly democratic origins, educated in a small Midwestern college, and coming to intellectual maturity not through study, travel, research, conversation with brilliant peers, although he did enjoy that quite a bit in later life, or the influence of national or international universities, although he was very much at home with us at Troy, but a man coming to maturity through radio announcing, sports broadcasting, motion pictures, home front Army service, union leadership, the banter and badinage of show business cronies, salesmanship for General Electric, and the hosting of a Western-oriented television series. And yet the outcome of this unorthodox, sometimes even haphazard education is an effectiveness judged by its results, the stabilizing of an unstable California during his governorship. The very end of the Cold War, no more the beginning of the end for communism itself, certainly not just as a political movement and or regime in the Soviet Union, but throughout the planet. All this achieved during his presidency. When he first declared for governor of California in 1966, so many in the academic world were at their most charitable amused, and in their most usual manner dismissive that a mere actor should aspire to become governor of California. By the time he left the presidency, these very same individuals had become strangely silent in dismissing his intelligence. Years later, following his passing, they are increasingly acknowledging his achievement, his eloquence, his sheer brain power. Ronald Reagan is then and remains something of an enigma. Definitely not a sphinx. The role he played was too smiling, too genial, on the surface at least, for such a comparison. Mikhail Gorbachev, who liked him personally, called him Grandfather Reagan. Others called him the Gipper, after the role he played in the 1940 film Newt Rockney, All-American. He himself, when writing his autobiography, drew upon his most famous film line, "Where's the rest of me?" from King's Row, 1942. In other words, Ronald Reagan might even be suspected of finding something enigmatic in himself, some further persona he was searching for and found in public life. He was called the Great Communicator. No one ever called him the Great Californian, although his critics, as in the case of the critics of Richard Nixon, frequently put their criticisms of him in the context of his Southern California career. And indeed, if one reviews the major milestones and preoccupations of his origins and early achievement, it is not difficult to place Ronald Reagan in a California context. He was, first of all, being born in Tampico, Illinois on 6 February 1911, he was one of the folks, one of those countless Midwesterners who from the 1880s onward migrated into Southern California in search of a better life. These are the people first described as the folks with a capital F by Louis Adamish, who was definitely not one of them, who would gather each year for the Iowa or Illinois or Missouri picnic in Long Beach unto the thousands, more than 20,000 in the case of the Iowa picnic, and celebrate their state of origin. They were Protestants, and so was he, baptized at the age of 11 into his mother's church, the Disciples of Christ, and strongly influenced throughout his development by evangelical Protestantism, as was the city to which he migrated, Los Angeles, with its 300 or so Protestant churches in the region, its function as the seedbed and origin of Pentecostalism, its adaptability to the local scene, as evident in the Foursquare Gospel Church of Amy Semple McPherson, even its traditions of outdoor religious pageants and choral music at Daisy Dell, leading to the creation in that same place of the Hollywood Bowl. The Midwesternism might lead, this Midwesternism of Los Angeles might lead H.L. Mencken to describe Los Angeles as a double Dubuque, But then again, Macon was still aggrieved. He was aggrieved at the time he made this remark at how much it had cost him to take a taxi from Union Station out to the west side upon his arrival in the City of Angels. A more favorable analysis of this evangelical tradition might suggest that the folks would find in Los Angeles and greater Southern California opportunities for renewal, redemption, a second chance. But all that, for the time being, was in the future. As Ronald Reagan attended high school in Dixon, Illinois, serving as a lifeguard at the Rock River in Lowell Park near Dixon, attending Eureka College, where he studied economics and sociology and showed an aptitude for campus politics, sports, theater, football, and swimming. His interest in and skills at sports broadcasting might have brought him east to New York, perhaps, to give a try at becoming a sports announcer, working for a team in a stadium or on a radio station, which is what happened to him in a way. An announcer's job at radio station WOC in Davenport, $100 per month, moving with the station to Des Moines as an announcer for the Chicago Cubs games, recreating games from The Wire. But that took him to Southern California, that job. Took him to Southern California in 1937, traveling there with the Cubs, taking a screen test and getting a 7-year contract with Warner Brothers. Would his life have been different had he remained in Illinois or had he headed east? Here we are approaching closer to our theme, his formation in Southern California as a Southern Californian. History allows us to remember and re-envision Washington, George Washington, in the context of his being a Virginia planter, of remembering and re-envisioning John Adams, the Massachusetts Yankee, or Abe Lincoln, the Illinois lawyer. In each case, the social, cultural, and political context of the places helped form the temper of the president. So too was Ronald Reagan, formed from those Midwestern evangelical Protestant beginnings by the matrix and opportunities of Southern California, the Southern California he came to as a young man and flourished as well through middle-aged. But first of all, one last point, the United States Army. Short-sightedness kept him on the home front during World War II, but well before his migration to Southern California, in April 1937, at the age of 26, he took a home study Army extension course and enlisted as a private in a United States Cavalry Reserve unit in Des Moines, and was shortly thereafter, being a college graduate and passing the appropriate examination, commissioned a second lieutenant in the reserve. His first public act, it can be argued, aligned him with federal service. Long before the draft went into effect in 1940, 2 years before the Second World War broke out, and approximately 5 years before the United States entered that war, he put himself into federal service, joining the most traditional, indeed the most romantic of Army branches, because in part it spoke to a theatrical sense he had of himself. He rode well. He looked great in his officer's uniform. As an officer, he understood the role the Army was asking him to play. He was ready for service. An ambition such as this, to be somebody, to play a role, an authentic role, if at all possible, given his athleticism, his all-American good looks, his broad smile and charm, the mid-American simplicity of his origins, his non-bookish but highly active intelligence, his desire to make an end run in life fit him perfectly for motion pictures, an industry long since localized in Southern California. In one sense, it doesn't really matter how good an actor he was. Had he been a great actor, he would have remained exactly that, a great actor across a lifetime, like Clark Gable or his good friend Robert Taylor, a noted Hollywood conservative. And he would remain that actor and be remembered that way. As an actor, he was good enough to get by, However, as Lou Cannon points out in a number of his films, in the case of 2 or 3 of his films, he was far, far better than that. But he was never so good at it that he became imprisoned in a role of playing roles. From this perspective, this ordinary actor from the Midwest, formed by faith and popular culture and Midwestern values, found in Hollywood like Ishmael found on the Pequod in Melville's Moby Dick, his Harvard, his Yale, his USC. For at the time he entered motion pictures, the motion picture industry, as Arthur Schlesinger Jr. would later point out, the motion picture industry was at its point of highest connection with the American people. Throughout the Great Depression, the motion picture industry had been in dialogue with the American people, offering them the stories and dreams, illuminative, compensatory, critical, reconciling, allowing the American people to move through the Great Depression, helped in great measure by entertainment, by connection to motion pictures, which from the beginning, from its very nature as technology and art form, allowed for a direct connection with the masses of ordinary Americans. The roles he played, moreover, with 1 or 2 exceptions, tended to nurture in him the best friend, the Dutch uncle, the American optimist, the ordinary guy coping with extraordinary challenges. And in the mythic figure of the cowboy, he also found another identity underneath in real life, not only Second Lieutenant Ronald Reagan of the U.S. Army Reserve, but something else, something unfolding, something still mysterious to him at that time. He was now indeed a Southern Californian, albeit of a special variety, motion picture actor. There were dangers in this situation, dangers that his critics would later accuse him of succumbing to. Professionally, he was an actor, a dream maker, functioning in the borderlands of dream and reality, ever in danger of failing to know the difference. But wait a minute. It can be argued that all of Southern California, not just the motion picture industry, was likewise a product of imaginative as well as social and economic invention, of self-will and luck extended to ordinary Americans being, or at the least dreaming of being, something else, like Lana Turner enjoying a milkshake in Schwab's drugstore, or Jane Russell working as a medical assistant in Van Nuys, of being suddenly propelled into something more than the ordinary, or at least in believing that something like this could at some point happen. He was an actor, true, married to an actress, Jane Wyman. The 2 of them wed in 1940 at the wee Kirk of the Heather in Forest Lawn, a stage set of a chapel inspired by Sir Walter Scott, that the same year that Richard and Pat Nixon were married at the Mission Inn in Riverside. Another spatialization of an imagined Southern California place. 2 forces, however, the Second World War and Union politics, intervened in his education. Called to active duty in April 1942, his war service remained connected to communication as entertainment and to entertainment as communication. After a brief period as a liaison officer at the port of embarkation at Fort Mason in San Francisco, he transferred to Army Air Force Public Relations and worked throughout the war, first in the production of the show This Is the Army, assembled and rehearsed in Burbank, then later at the 1st Motion Picture Unit in Culver City, producing training and other promotional films for the military. Prevented by poor eyesight from serving overseas, he nevertheless found himself at the heart of the communication of value by, for, and to the military that was essential for victory. And at the same time, he spent most of these war years in what had become, in Southern California, the Gibraltar of the Pacific, a massively mobilized epicenter of aircraft and shipbuilding, military training, and allied processing for mobilization and deployment. Although his activities as an official in the Screen Actors Guild contributed to the breakup of his first marriage as he became more active in the Guild after the war, his union presidency after 1947 likewise kept him from a complete immersion in Hollywood value, while at the same time kept him concerned with the relationship of those values to the national experience. The issue was now not only the ordinary labor management disputes, but something more important, monumental even, communism, not as something remote as the Iron Curtain fell over Eastern Europe, or even something remote and dangerous as in the outbreak of the Korean War, but something more domestic, more connected to the local scene, the Southern California scene, the infiltration of communist value, even communist agents, into the motion picture industry. Most of these tensions had been put on hold during the Second World War when the Soviet Union was an American ally. The Cold War now brought it all back with a vengeance. To this day, it is difficult to speak about this period in an even-handed manner. No one wants to be identified as a McCarthyite. On the other hand, even such a temporary communist as Bud Schulberg Jr. has acknowledged that there were communist sympathizers, if not active members of the party, if not agents, in and around and through interlocking motion picture industry circles. This is not, of course, to defend the wholesale blacklisting of so many innocent people on the left. Indeed, Ronald Reagan was still at the time a registered Democrat, a lifelong admirer of Franklin Delano Roosevelt, another great communicator. Nor is it to defend the activities of the California State Un-American Activities Committee headed by State Senator John Tenney, otherwise known to history as the author of the song Mexicali Rose in Waltz Time. So oppressive did the environment in California become during this time. Novelist Thomas Mann, a resident of Pacific Palisades who had become an American citizen during the war, left the United States and spent the rest of his life in Switzerland. Still, as far as Hollywood was concerned, Ronald Reagan at the time belonged to the fiercely anti-communist wing of the Democratic Party and is known to have been in contact with the FBI regarding, one supposes with some certainty, communist infiltration. Because the whole blacklisting era is so fraught with abuses, it is difficult for many to regard this phase of Ronald Reagan's career in an even-handed manner. Other Hollywood personalities who gave similar testimony and or information, Sterling Hayden, for example, Gary Cooper, Adolphe Menjou, Jack Warner, Elia Kazan, were treated in retrospect in a manner depending upon their prior political profile. A conservative such as Adolphe Menjou, for example, was not penalized by the left at all. Menjou, after all, was only acting as what he was, a conservative. Elia Kazan, by contrast, who was on the left, was never forgiven by the left for his testimony, for his witness. In later years, Melvin Douglas, a motion picture star on the left, claimed that Ronald Reagan began to leave the Democratic Party when he began to believe in the speeches he was giving for General Electric. I believe the matter was more complicated, more connected to what was going on in Ronald Reagan's Southern California at the time, namely the years leading up to and including the blacklist era. Left liberals such as Arthur Schlesinger Jr. responded to the presence of communists or pro-communist in left circles by becoming fiercely anti-communist, but remaining liberals. But something else, I believe, was occurring in Ronald Reagan at the time, faced as he was with the possibility that the left had been soft on communism. In any event, these years in Southern California constitute, I believe, the beginnings of a transformation, together with his meeting of actress Nancy Davis and their marriage in March 1952 at yet another representative Southern California place, the Little Brown Church in the San Fernando Valley, with actor William Holden serving as Ronald Reagan's best man. Nancy Reagan, as she now became, was the adopted daughter of Loyal Davis, a Chicago neurosurgeon prominent in conservative political circles. A graduate of Smith College, class of 1943, she was solidly upper middle class. From this perspective, she represented a significant upward mobility and an opening to conservatism for her newly wedded husband, who was already heading in that direction. And yet Nancy Davis Reagan, for all her surface polish, her social credentials, her degree from Smith, she was also aware that she had had a hardscrabble beginning, a difficult beginning. She was also aware that she was born under a different name, Anne Frances Robbins, the only child of a car salesman and his actress wife. Her parents divorced shortly after her birth. Anne Frances Robbins was raised by an aunt and uncle until the time in 1929 when her mother married Dr. Davis, who formally adopted Nancy in 1935 when her name was legally changed to Nancy Davis. Thus, Nancy Davis Reagan, as well as her husband Ronald, were each products of a process of transformation and self-invention. In Nancy Davis's case, through her mother's marriage and her own adoption, and her own education. From the late 19th century onward, Southern California was replete with Americans who were in the process and had successfully reinvented themselves. And no place was more replete than Hollywood, where an acrobat, juggler, and mime by the name of Archie Leach could put the pain and shame of his childhood behind him and become the quintessentially Anglo-American gentleman, Cary Grant. As Ronald Reagan's biographer Lou Cannon has pointed out, Nancy Davis was a better actress than she was ever given credit for, given the fact that her acting abilities were judged at a later time in a political context, and especially through the movie Hellcats of the Navy, 1957, in which she starred opposite her husband. People such as Nancy and Ronald Reagan, the product of their own and or their parents' self-invention, are especially sensitive to the chance and the fragility of life, the capacity of things to go one way or another, depending on small decisions or what we today call tipping points. Hence, they become natural conservatives. Married to this intelligent and well-bred woman, moreover, a graduate of Smith College, a woman who knew where she came from before she was 8, and where she came from after her mother's marriage, and where she was coming from after she refashioned herself, Ronald Reagan was thoroughly prepared for his entry into corporate circles. A photograph from the 1950s shows the two of them at Perino's on Wilshire Boulevard, dining together, just the two of them, chic, dapper, upper middle class, at the top of their game. In reality, moreover, things were more complicated. When Ronald Reagan's film career began to show signs of ending, he began to search for new possibilities. In one instance, he starred in a revue in Las Vegas, but he was already beyond that. Through marriage and through his own personal charm, he had become a candidate for entrance into the Los Angeles oligarchy in a manner in which the oligarchy would never allow a candidacy to Richard Nixon, whose humble origins and insecurities constituted such a barrier, even though Nixon enjoyed the continuing endorsement of the Los Angeles Times. Ronald Reagan was still a registered Democrat when he endorsed Eisenhower in 1952 and 1956, and Richard Nixon in 1960. He became a Republican in 1962 and came to prominence via his many speeches for General Electric as a supporter for Barry Goldwater in 1964, for whom he gave the pivotal speech, Time for Choosing, that raised $1 million for the Goldwater campaign and signaled his own arrival as a political force. Becoming a Republican was a very Southern California thing to do. Considered historically, California was a Republican state, with only 2 Democratic governors in the 20th century up to the time Ronald Reagan joined the GOP. California was a paradox. It promoted a certain kind of freedom, eccentricity even, yet it was also a suburbanized state, Southern California especially, filled with Americans who had bettered themselves, moved to the suburbs, and wanted sustainability, wanted stability. Even San Francisco was a Republican city, and in the 20th century did not get a Democratic mayor until the mid-1960s. The San Francisco Jewish establishment was overwhelmingly Republican up to that time. The only president to have come from California to that point, Herbert Hoover, was a Republican, and Richard Nixon, who had come the closest to becoming the second president from California, was a suburbanite, representing a suburban district. Orange County at the time was thoroughly suburban and thoroughly Republican. Republican California came in two categories. First of all, there was the direct heirs to the early 20th century progressives, epitomized by Governor Earl Warren, who incorporated in his thought and action simultaneously liberal and conservative tendencies, as did the first great progressive Republican governor, Hiram Johnson, and as would later Ronald Reagan. In its progressive wing, which included by mid-20th century the liberal wing, Republicans were not anti-government. In point of fact, they loved government. They reformed it between 1911 and 1917. And despite the fact that by the 1950s, Republicans were approximately 1 million voters fewer in registration than Democrats, they were elected and reelected to most statewide and important local offices, thanks in part to cross-filing, which allowed them to enter Democratic primaries, but also thanks to the good reputation Republicans had achieved as reform-minded administrators. On the other hand, since the war, a new kind of republicanism had been coming into Southern California from the Sun Belt. This kind of republicanism was fiercely anti-communist, or deliberately self-consciously anti-communist, highly suspicious, or let's say highly favorable to the limitations of government, and strongly anchored in evangelical Protestant Christianity. The 1960s witnessed the victory of this genre of republicanism in Southern California and the corralling of liberal republicanisms into the Bay Area and a few other places. Dwight D. Eisenhower, whom Ronald Reagan supported, was a moderate to liberal Republican. Barry Goldwater, whom Ronald Reagan supported 8 years later, was not a liberal Republican. Ronald Reagan, by this time, was something of each. Once again, California, in this case Northern California, as well as Southern California, had played a part in his development. For the majority of voting Californians, even the voting Californians of Northern California, the voting protests at Berkeley in 1964 and associated protests up and down the state against the Vietnam War had gone too far. Whatever else the first half of the 1960s might have been in more serene places, in California, North and South, they were disruptive and divisive and created a fault line, a shift of tectonic plates that brought Ronald Reagan into office as governor in 1966, in some measure because he opposed the demonstrations. A few years later, a similar wave of protest would sweep others into office. On the other hand, as he soon proved, Ronald Reagan was not devoid of a number of Republican traits linked to the progressive reform tradition. Some of his closest associates in Sacramento, Caspar Weinberger, for example, his budget director, and Edwin Meese, his legal affairs secretary, later his chief of staff, were Bay Area Republicans. As governor, Ronald Reagan dealt successfully with a Democratic majority in the legislature and signed the largest tax hike to that point in California history. The Reagan circle of friends included a wide variety of political opinions, included the Bloomingdales, Rock Hudson, and Frank Sinatra. Could all this have happened elsewhere? Could a sportscaster get a screen test and a 7-year contract from a studio anywhere else? Could a New Deal Democrat reinvent himself consistently, maintaining dialogue with his earliest values, reinvent himself as a Republican, and still win consistently 22 to 27% of the Democratic vote? Could this happen anywhere else but California? Where else could a relatively minor Hollywood actor have become governor and presidential contender? Where else could an earlier formation in evangelical Christianity flower forth as a political force, while at the same time remaining basically non-sectarian in its approach? Although the evil in Evil Empire, a phrase that helped end the Soviet Union, had a distinctly theological cast. From radio broadcasting and motion pictures, Ronald Reagan learned the value of wit, brevity, one-liners, as in, "I hope you are all Republicans," spoken to the doctors about to treat him following the assassination attempt, or "Mr. Gorbachev, tear down that wall," spoken in Berlin, or "There you go again," which virtually ended the political career of Jimmy Carter, or "I've paid for this microphone," which put George H.W. Bush's presidential aspirations on hold for another 8 years. These are movie lines. This is movie dialogue. This is sportscasters' dialogue, and it worked. Elected president, he would become something much more than a California politician. Yet in addition to the circle of Californians he brought with him to the White House, he brought California as well as his earlier Midwest to Washington. If Thomas Jefferson was indeed the great Sphinx, the ultimately unknown, the inscrutable, we must also remember that Ronald Reagan's conservatism, as he himself insisted, in its suspicion of big government especially, had Jeffersonian origins. California helped him onto a wider stage, where for a bigger studio he wrote a script of global importance. And yet still he remains something of an enigma, a man at once obvious and mysterious, a figure challenging analysis as we observe the centennial of his birth at a university that bears the name of the region, Southern California. Southern California, coast of dreams, Southern California, land of self-invention that would define the pathways he pursued and would empower him to make that journey, a journey to service, a journey to achievement on a global scale, a journey to greatness, a journey to a better world for all of us. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you very much, Kevin, for a remarkable speech, for your insights into President Reagan's personality and intellect, and into his background, origins, and context that really helped shape his legacy of leadership. Thank you very much. I also want to thank Stewart and the Ronald Reagan Foundation and the Centennial Celebration for their partnership with us. It's been, as I mentioned earlier, a great partnership, and I think we're off to a great beginning with this conference. I also want to thank all the panelists for coming and sharing their insights and wisdom with us, and appreciate their thoughts today as well. And I want to remind you that tomorrow we will convene at 9 a.m. For the next panel in this room, and I invite you all back, and I hope you can make it. And now we have the opportunity to go upstairs to the lobby, and there is a reception for all of us. So please enjoy the reception, and thank you all for coming.